The film begins in the year 1914 with a group of explorers aboard a ship in the Atlantic Ocean, heading toward an island located in the middle of the ocean. On the ship, we see a young man named David, who is going to the island to submit a weather report. David is supposed to stay on the island for a year, and his mission is to record weather data throughout the year, then return after completing the task. We learn that David has been on the ship for 67 days, and this is the last day of the journey because they have finally reached the island. At that time, the ship's captain, whose name is Axel, comes and decides to personally take David to the island. As soon as they reach the island's borders, they move by a small boat until they reach the shore. David has brought enough food and drink to last him the entire year. However, David and Axel are surprised that no one is there to receive them, especially since there is a weather observer named Aldo whom David is supposed to replace, as Aldo has finished his duty and is meant to return with Axel to the ship. David discovers that the island contains only an old lighthouse and a small house. This house is where David is supposed to live for a full year, just like the previous weather observer did. It is clear that the house has been abandoned for some time. Axel returns the ship's crew to the boat and heads with David toward the lighthouse, hoping to find out what happened to the previous weather observer. On the way, they discover that someone has written his name on the freshwater fountain. The name is Gruner, and it says that the fountain belongs to him. When they reach the lighthouse, they discover that it is completely surrounded by sharpened wooden stakes, as if it has been fortified, though in a primitive way. They understand that the stakes were made to protect the lighthouse from any possible attack. They knock on the door to meet the lighthouse keeper, but no one answers despite their repeated knocking. They are forced to break the door open and enter the lighthouse. They go up to the upper floor and find the keeper asleep. When he wakes up, they learn that his name is Gruner. Axel asks him about the previous weather observer who was on the island. Gruner says that he was infected with typhoid and that before he died, he suddenly left and walked toward the sea, and he has not been seen since. It becomes clear that Axel is not convinced by Gruner's story and feels that something is wrong. He talks to David and offers to take him back with him, but David refuses and decides to continue the mission. Axel takes out a pistol and asks David to keep it so he can defend himself, but David refuses to take the gun, saying he will not need it. He thanks Axel for his concern and says goodbye before he leaves. Afterward, David tells himself that he must live for 12 months on an island that feels like solitary confinement, and on top of that, he will be living with someone who seems mentally unstable, all just to record the strength and direction of the wind. But he is forced to do it. David goes to clean the house and prepare his observation tools. At night, he finds the previous weather observer's diary in a desk drawer. He sits in front of the fireplace and opens it to see what is written inside. He finds that the first pages contain information about different marine creatures. Suddenly, he finds a picture of a woman with the word love written 3 times on the back. He understands that this must be the wife of the previous weather observer, and this makes him realize that the man must have felt lonely. Suddenly, David sees drawings of strange creatures attacking humans. He is surprised because these creatures look like they are from another world. He does not understand why the previous observer drew them and assumes they might have been products of his imagination due to loneliness and a desire to pass the time. David keeps looking at the drawings until he falls asleep. The next day, David begins his work. He measures the wind speed and collects weather data. But when he reaches a place near the sea, he suddenly stops because he finds circles of rocks filled with seashells arranged on the sand. The shells are placed in a specific pattern, and it is impossible that nature made them this way. He realizes that someone arranged them like that and assumes it was Gruner. However, David does not think much of it and continues his work. While working, he hears Gruner's voice from the lighthouse. He raises his binoculars toward him and is surprised to see someone else with Gruner in the lighthouse, but that person disappears in the blink of an eye. He assumes it is just hallucinations because he did not sleep well the previous night. Late at night, David hears knocking on the door. He thinks it is Gruner, but the sound turns into scratching on the door. David becomes tense and quietly approaches the door. Suddenly, he sees the hand of a strange creature coming from under the door. It looks like the drawings he saw in the diary. He hits the creature's hand and runs to hide in the cellar. He hears the creature enter the house and move around as if searching for something. David begins to watch what is happening through a crack in the wood. Suddenly, the creature looks at him. David stabs it in the eye with a knife. He then hears it scream and run away. David is afraid to come out of his hiding place because he expects the creature to attack again. At that moment, he becomes certain that everything written in the diary was true. Out of fear, he locks himself in the cellar and cannot sleep. The next day, David cautiously leaves the house. He finds the creature's footprints in the sand and notices that there are footprints of more than one creature. He follows them and sees that they lead toward the sea. At that moment, David begins to understand the truth about what is happening on the island. He becomes certain that Gruner built fortifications around the lighthouse to protect himself from these creatures. This means that David's presence in the house puts his life in danger. He runs quickly to the lighthouse, knocks repeatedly on the door, and calls out to Gruner. But Gruner pours water on him and tells him to go away, saying that he was not supposed to stay on the island. David leaves and returns to the house, where he begins to fortify it completely. He places wooden boards over the windows and nails them in place. Then he makes wooden stakes around the entire house and digs a hole in front of the door. He puts all his newspapers and books inside it and pours a flammable substance over them so he can set them on fire when the creatures attack. After finishing his preparations, he searches inside the house for anything that can help him. He finds an old wooden box containing a rifle and ammunition. He quickly prepares the rifle and waits until night falls. Then he approaches the window and prepares to defend himself. David is shocked when he sees a large number of these creatures emerging from the sea, all running quickly toward the house. As soon as they arrive, they destroy all the fortifications he built and attack the house, trying to get inside. David starts shooting at them and manages to kill many. He thinks that gunfire will scare them away, but their numbers keep increasing. He decides to set the papers on fire. The creatures become afraid of the flames and run quickly back toward the sea. Unfortunately, the fire grows and catches the door, then spreads quickly inside the house because it is entirely made of wood. David tries to put out the fire but fails. He wraps a blanket around himself and escapes before the house burns completely. He runs quickly and hides behind a large rock. There, he discovers that his arm is injured. He sits terrified and shocked, unable to fully grasp what happened. He is also deeply frustrated, especially since the house has burned down and he has nowhere to live. Fortunately, a storm begins and it starts raining, and the rain extinguishes the fire that had spread through the house. The next day, David returns and finds that a large part of it has been destroyed. He ties his injured arm with a handkerchief, takes the rifle, and leaves the house. He goes to watch Gruner and fetches water from the fountain. Then he raises the gun to threaten him. Suddenly, one of the creatures attacks David, pushes him away, and knocks him to the ground. David raises the rifle and is about to kill it, but Gruner arrives, points his weapon at David, and orders him to lower his gun. David refuses and tells Gruner to lower his weapon because he is going to kill the creature. Gruner obeys and lowers his weapon, asking David what he wants. David tells him that he wants to live with him in the lighthouse and informs him that he has plenty of food and drink. Gruner agrees and explains that the creature is not harmful. He tells him that it is a female and that she listens to him. To prove it, he calls her, and she goes to him and stands beside him like a pet. After that, David and Gruner go to the hut and begin gathering as much food, water, and anything else useful as possible. David tells Gruner that the previous observer did not die from typhoid and that the sea creatures must have attacked and killed him. David believes that Gruner let him die alone and refused to help him. Gruner remains silent and does not respond, so David changes the subject. They realize they must return to the lighthouse before night falls. They take the box of food and head toward the lighthouse. Later, we see David sleeping inside the lighthouse. He wakes up to the creature licking his injured hand. Startled, he quickly pulls his hand away. Gruner returns from outside and asks if the wound has healed, explaining that the saliva of these creatures heals wounds. He leaves David and goes upstairs to gather ammunition. David follows him and asks how he deals with the creature. Gruner says he gives her orders like any pet. David notices that Gruner treats her harshly. Gruner says she accepts the treatment, and the proof is that she has not tried to escape. He explains that he found her in his fishing net when she was still young and unable to escape, about to die, but he saved her at the last moment. Since then, she has lived with him and obeyed him. David appears fascinated by the creature. He approaches her and talks to Gruner about the theory of isolated marine beings that evolved to survive. The creature approaches David when she senses his interest in her. This does not please Gruner, so he interrupts David and takes him to the balcony. He explains that these creatures hate bright light, but the one with him is different because she became accustomed to light since childhood. David asks him why he did not leave with the ship that brought him. Gruner says there is no reason for him to leave, especially since he lives on the island like a king of his own time. Gruner then asks David why he left civilization in the city to come to the island. David says he did it for the money and adds that if he wants to leave at any time, he will signal the first passing ship. Gruner mocks him and says that no ships pass through this region, meaning that absolutely no ships come through this area. Therefore, David is forced to wait for the ship that will come after a full year to take him back. David goes to prepare the rest of his belongings that were not burned and notices that the creature watches his every move. He treats her kindly to make up for the harsh treatment Gruner gives her. When night comes, Gruner asks David to take his weapon and join him on the balcony. David obeys, and together they prepare for the creatures' attack. Gruner explains how to fight them, saying he only shoots when they get close and that he fires only one bullet at each of them because the creatures eat any of their own who are injured. David notices that the female creature is standing at the top of the lighthouse, making loud sounds so the others can hear her and come out of the sea. When the creatures finally arrive, Gruner quickly attacks them. Fear takes over David, and he retreats inside the lighthouse in shock. He watches Gruner kill them until he faints. The next day, Gruner pours water on David to wake him up. He angrily tells him that he will not accept someone useless living with him, and he says that from this moment on, he must help him with everything. He sends him to fetch water from the fountain, and David obeys and does what he is told. At night, Gruner asks him to prepare for the attack of the strange creatures and tells him that this is his last chance. He says that if he wants to live, he must be braver than this. They go out together to the balcony, but as soon as the creatures appear, Gruner goes back inside the lighthouse and locks the door on David so that he can toughen up and defend himself alone. The next day, Gruner opens the balcony door and finds David sitting on the ground, covered in blood, after managing to confront the creatures and stop their attack on the lighthouse. After that incident, the days pass for David on the island. The days are boring and all look the same. David continues helping Gruner to secure his place in the lighthouse, and at night they defend themselves against the attacks of the strange creatures. During this period, David counts the days on the wall and remembers that the reason he came to the island was to find peace and quiet in a place far away from people. Instead, he finds himself living in hell. Amid all this, David wonders why the creatures do not attack every night. 2 full weeks pass without seeing them. While searching for wood on the island, he finds the skeleton of a large whale on the shore. He begins collecting the bones to carve and create artistic pieces from them. During these days, David grows closer to the female creature. Each passing day, his sympathy for her increases. He decides to befriend her and names her Ani. One night, David and Gruner are sitting and playing chess. They become so absorbed in the game that they forget to turn on the lighthouse lights. They are suddenly surprised when the creatures attack them inside the lighthouse. They try to repel the attack, but the creatures are numerous. David and Gruner are forced to lock themselves in the top floor of the lighthouse. Gruner is badly injured in his leg. Despair takes over them, and they surrender to their fate. But when the sun rises, the creatures leave them and return to the sea. Afterward, Ani heals Gruner's injury. David informs Gruner that the ammunition is almost gone, and they realize they must find another way to defend themselves or they will die. Later, David goes toward the shore and finds a chain thrown on the ground. He understands that it belongs to one of the strange creatures. At that moment, he sees a ship passing in the sea. He runs quickly to get the signal gun to use it, but Gruner catches up with him and stops him, saying he does not want anyone to know the island's location. Ani screams at Gruner because he hit David and knocked him to the ground. David is shocked and deeply frustrated because he lost a great opportunity to return to the city. Days later, David hears Gruner yelling at Ani and beating her. Ani runs out of the lighthouse, and David follows her. He notices that she is afraid of the weapon he is carrying, so he places it on a rock and approaches her calmly. Then he shows her the boat he carved from whale bones. Ani becomes attentive and leads David to a distant place on the shore. There, David finds an abandoned boat on the sand. He returns to the lighthouse and tells Gruner about the boat. Gruner says he already knows about it. David blames him for not mentioning it before and suggests using it to return to the city. Gruner mocks him and says that would mean certain death because the boat would not survive the storms and heavy waves. He could also die from hunger and thirst on the way if the creatures did not attack him first and end his life. David asks how the boat reached the island's shore. Gruner explains that it belonged to a Portuguese sailor who brought it to shore after surviving the sinking of his ship, but the strange creatures attacked and killed him. David is confused because Gruner had previously told him that no ships pass through this area. Gruner explains that the ship had been smuggling dynamite, so it could not use the known commercial routes. David then suggests retrieving the dynamite from the ocean floor and using it in their war against the creatures. When David returns to the lighthouse, he shows Gruner an old diving suit and says he can use it to dive underwater. Gruner refuses at first, seeing it as too dangerous and fearing David might die. The next day, David sees Ani swimming in a small lake on the island. He takes off his clothes and joins her in the water. Gruner sees them and feels jealous. When they return to the lighthouse, Gruner throws the diving suit to David and says he has changed his mind and agrees to help retrieve the dynamite. It becomes clear that Gruner agreed hoping David would die during the mission and rid him of his presence. When they reach the shipwreck area, David puts on the diving suit and goes underwater. He finds the dynamite crates, ties them with a rope, and Gruner pulls them up to the boat. At that moment, David sees two small creatures swimming near him. Startled, he falls to the seabed. Because the diving suit is heavy, he cannot stand up. He pulls the oxygen hose several times to signal that he is suffocating and needs rescue, but Gruner sees what is happening and ignores it. David is forced to remove the diving suit quickly and swim back to the boat. When they return to the lighthouse, they open the dynamite crates and find that some are flooded with water. However, when they open the remaining crates, they find the dynamite still intact. They plant the dynamite in 2 batches in front of the lighthouse. Days pass, winter arrives, and snow begins to fall. Gruner becomes irritated by the creature's lack of attacks. One day, David discovers that Gruner spent the entire night on the balcony with his hand on the dynamite detonator. He is nearly frozen to death. David warns him and gently removes his hand from the device, asking him to go inside. Before following him, David disconnects the wires from the detonator. 3 weeks pass without any attack from the strange creatures. Gruner, imagining that Ani warned her kind, beats her in anger. David becomes upset and pulls her away from him quickly. He tells Gruner they must set a trap for the creatures. At night, they leave the lighthouse door open. David waits by the door, while Gruner takes Ani to the top floor and forces her to make loud sounds to lure her kind. After some time, one of the creatures appears, enters the lighthouse, and attacks David. David manages to defend himself and kill it. He then climbs the stairs and shoots at the rest of the creatures entering through the door. Meanwhile, Gruner tries to detonate the dynamite but fails. He is forced to defend himself with all his strength until David arrives and reconnects the wires to the detonator. Once he finishes, he detonates the first batch of dynamite, which wipes out most of the strange creatures. Gruner becomes excited and decides to detonate the second batch. A massive explosion occurs, and they both lose consciousness. The next day, they wake up and go outside to assess the damage. Gruner finishes off any creature that is still alive, but David cannot bring himself to do the same. He notices a chain around the neck of one of the creatures, and it looks like the chain he had found earlier. David realizes that the chain he found must have belonged to someone close to that creature. This proves to him that these creatures are intelligent and behave like humans. However, Gruner does not care about any of that. He grabs the chain and throws it into the water. That night, the creatures do not attack them. They discover that Ani has escaped and has not returned to the lighthouse. David and Gruner hear her crying, and David assumes she is sad because of what happened to her kind, but Gruner tells him she always behaves that way. Later, she returns to the lighthouse. The next day, David walks along the shore and notices 2 young creatures playing among the waves. He builds a circle of rocks like the one he saw when he first arrived on the island and places inside it the small boat he carved from whale bones, attempting to show goodwill toward the creatures. He returns to the lighthouse and uses the binoculars to see what will happen, but he finds that the boat remains in its place. The following day, David discovers that Gruner has fallen asleep from too much drinking. Among his belongings, David finds the same photo of the woman he saw in the previous weather observer's diary. But this time, the weather observer is standing beside the woman in the picture. On the back of the photo, David finds the word love written 3 times. He finally understands that Gruner is actually the previous weather observer himself, and that being separated from his wife drove him insane and made him surrender to isolation and loneliness. David is deeply affected by this realization and becomes afraid that he too might lose his mind. He decides to erase the day count he had written on the wall. At the end of the day, David goes for a walk on the shore and discovers that the creatures have taken the small boat from inside the circle of rocks. Suddenly, a young creature approaches him. David drops the torch he is holding and steps away from it to reassure the creature and show that he means no harm. The young creature moves closer to him, and at the same time, many other creatures appear, including Ani. The child approaches David to give him back the boat, but Gruner interrupts the moment and fires a shot into the air. David stands in front of him and tells him they were wrong. He says the creatures only want to live in peace, but Gruner ignores him and orders Ani to return to the lighthouse. To his surprise, Ani does not obey. He becomes furious, returns to the lighthouse, and repeats the phrase, "No one leaves Gruner." Meanwhile, David tries to play with the young creature to build more trust with him, but Gruner fires the signal gun, hitting and killing one of the creatures. The creatures panic and retreat into the water. Ani looks at David with a sad expression, then leaves him and walks away. David becomes furious about what happened. He returns to the lighthouse and fights with Gruner. Gruner overpowers him and grabs an axe to kill him. At that moment, David calls him by his real name and tells him that the weather observer is not a killer. When Gruner hears this, he is deeply shaken. He drops the axe and repeats the word love 3 times. Then he leaves the lighthouse and surrenders himself to the strange creatures so they can take revenge on him for what he did to them. The creatures attack Gruner and kill him. David locks the door behind him, realizing that he is now completely alone on the island. Months pass until the year comes to an end. 3 officers arrive at the lighthouse and try to wake David. He is sleeping in the former weather observer's old bed. They inform him that they have come to replace him with a new weather observer. They assume that he is Gruner, the lighthouse keeper. Strangely, David does not correct them. He tells them that the weather observer died of typhoid and that before he died, he walked toward the sea and never returned. David gets up and walks out to the balcony, looking at the warships in front of him. A sarcastic smile appears on his face because he has no intention of returning to his homeland. At that moment, Annie watches from a distance. As soon as she sees the warships, she dives quickly into the water to warn her kind about the war that is coming. The film ends. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. You can suggest any series or movies you would like us to summarize in the comments. See you in the next recap.